Okay, welcome to my video on the female feedback loop. So we learned the feedback loop for the male. Today we're going to be talking about the feedback loop for females, and it starts off very similar. So you'll notice that we always start in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, when we hit puberty, is going to release a hormone called GnRH, which stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone. So just based on the name, we can tell that it has something to do with the gonads. In the female, the gonads are the ovaries, so we're going to be eventually dealing with the ovaries. So once that happens, we're going to go into the anterior pituitary, which again is the front part of the pituitary, closer to the front of your face. And the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to release FSH. So FSH is the very first hormone in this feedback loop that will be increasing. So if I was looking at a graph, FSH is going to be the very first one that goes up. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone is going to go into the ovary, and there is a place in the ovary called the follicle. So it's going to develop the follicle, stimulate it to just start developing, and once it starts to develop and grow, it actually releases estrogen, which is our second hormone. So first is FSH, then estrogen. Estrogen has two different jobs. First job is it deals with secondary sex characteristics, which are things that make a woman look like a woman. Okay, so things like breast tissue developing, things like your hips widening, okay, something like that. And estrogen's second job, more important job in this feedback loop, is it acts as positive feedback, which means it's turning something on. It's going to tell the anterior pituitary to release our third hormone. So first hormone was FSH, then estrogen. It's going to cause positive feedback, as in turning on our third hormone, which is LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone. So eventually, luteinizing hormone is in charge of forming the corpus luteum, which we're going to get to, and I'm going to explain what that is. So luteinizing hormone is also going to deal with going into our ovary. It's also going to go into the follicle. And before it can create the corpus luteum, the follicle has to get rid of the ovum, or the egg that it's been developing. So that is going to happen. So the follicle is left empty. And once it's empty, the tissue starts to develop and turn into something else, which we call the corpus luteum. So in a diagram, this would be looking a lot different. So sometimes you might see a flower shape or kind of like a spiral shape, something like that. And that's usually the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum releases our fourth hormone, which is progesterone. And progesterone has a really, really, really important job in this cycle, or this feedback loop, I should say. So the first thing that's important is it's going to basically tell the endometrial lining, which is the inside layer of our uterus, to thicken. So increase our endometrium. The reason we want to do that is because this egg just got released, or ovum just got released, and it is currently traveling through the fallopian tube, and it's hoping to meet up with the sperm so that it becomes fertilized. And if that happens, okay, the fertilized egg has to have somewhere to embed, and if it does not have a thick endometrial lining, the egg will actually be shed outside of the woman. So if it's a fertilized egg, we want it to have some nice place to grow, which would be a really nice thick endometrial lining for it to embed in and start to grow into an embryo. The second thing that it does is it's going to stop or inhibit uterine contractions. So that would be the myometrial layer of the uterus, the muscle layer of the uterus, the outside, contracts and squeezes the uterus. And when that happens, that would actually cause the endometrial lining to be lost. So we're going to inhibit that, or stop that, so that endometrial lining stays within the uterus, so that, again, the egg has a nice place to embed in and start to grow. And the last thing that it does, because we already released an egg, we're going to inhibit the ovary from releasing another egg. Eggs are precious. Women are only born with a set amount of them. So if we're releasing more than one egg every month, she's actually going to run out sooner than she would if she was only releasing one. And also, women's bodies are not meant to carry lots of babies at a time. Okay, so other organisms, other mammals have really, really large litters, like dogs, for example, have really large litters, but humans are only really meant to have one or two babies at a time. So, and it's usually just one. So we don't want another ovum to be released because that could potentially have another fertilized egg, which would eventually form fraternal twins. So that means two different eggs, two different sperm are fertilized, which isn't a bad thing. But again, we just don't want to get in the habit of doing that because eventually, if that's happening every single month, that woman's going to run out of eggs a lot sooner. So basically, this is the last process that's happening within the menstrual cycle. We're just basically waiting to see if the egg is fertilized, and if it is, it's going to basically embed in that endometrial lining and it's going to start the pregnancy. If not, okay, what's going to happen is if that egg is not fertilized, it's actually going to send us, it's going to, we're going to see the corpus luteum actually start to get smaller or degenerate. And when that happens, this progesterone is going to get lower because the corpus luteum is getting smaller. So if we have no fertilization occurring, what's going to happen is progesterone is going to act as a negative feedback. It's going to turn this mechanism off, and it's also going to then no longer inhibit uterine contractions. And if that happens, that means the uterus is going to contract. It's going to shed the endometrial lining, and we are going to see the next phase occur, which is flow phase. So I'm going to explain what these diamond shapes are. So let's just go back to the beginning. Flow phase is marked as the first phase, even though I kind of explained it as being last. The reason for that is because flow phase actually is the first physical sign in the woman that something is happening inside of her body. So that's going to mark day 1 of the menstrual cycle. Okay, this number 2 is actually pointing towards the follicular phase, which happens on day 6 to 13. So when we start releasing FSH and developing this follicle and starts releasing estrogen, that's follicular phase, and that happens after flow phase. Estrogen is going to go to the anterior pituitary. We're going to tell LH to be released. It's going to go into my follicle, and on day 14, the third process is going to happen. That's ovulation. So the ovum is released in ovulation. So it's number 3 on day 14. And after the follicle releases the ovum, when it's empty, it's going to go into the 4th phase, this last phase when we're basically just waiting for the ovum to be fertilized or not. And this is called luteal phase because we're dealing with the corpus luteum. You can use that to remember. Remember, this is when progesterone levels are going to be really high and we're inhibiting ovulation, increasing endometrial lining, and inhibiting uterine contractions. And if we have no fertilization occurs, okay, we're going to stop inhibiting uterine contractions. They're going to start, and we're going to shed my endometrial lining, and that's going to bring us back to the first phase of flow phase. So that is the feedback loop for a woman. This is basically also showing the menstrual cycle. These numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 is the menstrual cycle, and it's explaining kind of all 4 hormones. So we have FSH, estrogen, LH, and progesterone being released in that order. And if you have any questions for me, please let me know. But otherwise, have a great night and see you tomorrow.